to very basic services, water, electricity, waste collection, healthcare, education, etc., etc. And it's due to the fact that Israel is ramping up its efforts to try and consolidate its power in the Negev, to claim power over all of the resources in the area, and just essentially shunt the Palestinians out of the picture. What they've done is legalize several what they've called concentration towns to try and consolidate the Palestinian population of the Negev into these areas, rendering them much more easily controllable by the state. And yeah, continue their takeover of the area. So what the people of the Negev are facing is they can either try to live out these lives in these extremely threatened, unrecognized villages, or become assimilated into these concentration townships, which are some of the poorest and most deprived inside the country. On the 27th of July this year, a force of 1,500 Israeli police, flanked by bulldozers and helicopters, approached Al-Arakiv with one mission in mind: to raze it to the ground. They're rendering the entire population of the town homeless. This is actually the third time that the people of Al-Arakiv have been made homeless by the Israeli state, while the neighboring unrecognized village of Twal has been demolished no less than 40 times. The Negev is also much of the annexation of the area in the Negev is also due to the Jewish National Fund, which is, of course, the shadowy body that was in charge of many of the land grabs that were happening during the early years of the Israeli state and being turned over to new settlement projects. Also, many of the demolished Palestinian villages in the Negev are covered with what are now Jewish National Fund tree planting initiatives, 3 of which are actually dedicated to Australian Prime Ministers. But I think all of this behaviour, it really highlights that this aggressive campaign of demographic change, whether it's in the Negev, whether it's in the Galilee area, anywhere inside of Israel, I think it's very, very similar, hauntingly similar to what we see happening inside the occupied territories. And it brings up a lot of interesting questions about what constitutes a settlement. Is it just within the 1967 borders? Or is it within Israel and Palestine in its entirety? Meanwhile, in East Jerusalem, settlers have become essentially the biggest problem of all, due to the fact that Israel is really ramping up its efforts, its aggressive campaign of takeover of East Jerusalem, the Palestinian area, in what it would like to essentially become the undivided capital of the Jewish state. Which brings us to Sheikh Jarrah. It's a small Palestinian community in East Jerusalem, home to 28 families, where we've both spent a lot of time, due to the fact that 2 Israeli settler organizations are instigating a house-by-house takeover of the Palestinian neighborhood. So far, 5 Palestinian families have been evicted from Sheikh Jarrah and are now without a home. Now, the Palestinian families of Sheikh Jarrah are not taking this lying down. They're actually engaging in one of the best examples I've seen of community-based steadfast resistance. So what they will usually do when they're evicted from their houses, they will sleep outside their homes, sometimes for months on end, camping outside their homes, merely as a form of protest, watching the Israeli settlers come and go from their houses each day, but sending a very clear message that they're not going to be ethnically cleansed that easily. So what we've seen arisen in Sheikh Jarrah is a very volatile situation where you have very violent, very ideological settlers living literally next door to Palestinians. And this is why we've been there, maintaining pretty much a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week presence in Sheikh Jarrah for about the last 2 years, to try and give solidarity and support to the families, and also to be there to try and document and de-escalate violence when it does look like it's going to occur. And having spent so much time there, once again, it's very difficult to pull up a single example to illustrate the atmosphere in Sheikh Jarrah. But one day that will never leave my mind is the 1st of December last year, when settlers actually instigated a takeover of one of the Palestinian homes. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning, and 20 Israeli settlers marched through the front gates of the Al-Qurb house, which is what we're looking at here. They wasted no time. They barged through the front door of the house, and they immediately began turfing all of the family's possessions out onto the front lawn. And within a couple of minutes, the Jerusalem Police Department had arrived. And instead of stopping what the settlers were doing, they actually aided the settlers in the takeover of the house. They formed a human barricade between the settlers and us, the families and the activists trying to stop what they were doing. And it was a scene of complete chaos. Several people were arrested that day merely for trying to prevent the settlers from the violent takeover. Several members of the family fainted, unable to cope with the shock of being dehomed once again. And I think the worst image from that day was seeing 11-year-old Muhammad Al-Qur, one of the sons of the family, come home from school to see that settlers had taken over his house.
Sadly, I was unable to bear witness to all the events that unfolded that day. I was arrested within the first 20 minutes of the home takeover, merely for filming and documenting the events that occurred. I arrived in Palestine only about 10 days earlier. I quickly found my way to Sheikh Jarrah. It was night, and the streets were lit only by the orange glow of the streetlights and the raging fire that the Al-Gawis kept outside in their protest tent. Here they watched the settlers go in and out of the home that was theirs, that they called home, for over 50 years. It was really hard to hold back tears in watching these Palestinian families living on the street, witnessing people living in the home that they had been forcibly evicted from. However, they were still able to muster smiles and laughter amidst all this madness. And I really wondered how they could do it. Was it because there was so much solidarity within the community? Everybody came out and sat with them and went through this together. Was it because they had been under occupation for pretty much their whole lives? Or maybe it was because the residents of Sheikh Jarrah and their descendants were refugees only 60 years before. In 1948, the Nakba occurred, or the catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were evicted from their homes, their land annexed, and they became refugees almost instantly. They found their ways to Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, but some of them found their way to East Jerusalem, into the community of Sheikh Jarrah. Here the Jordanian government gave them land so that they could set up their refugee tents, and the United Nations offered them food aid for the first 8 years of their refugee status. In 1956, the United Nations gave the Palestinians who were refugees in Sheikh Jarrah houses that were subsidized by the United Nations in trade for their food aid that they were receiving. But the questions arise, how could Palestinians, how could people who are refugees a mere 50 years ago be threatened to become refugees again? And also, how can international activists be effective in standing in solidarity with these Palestinians? I'd like to show you a video that an ISM activist shot this past February. Here you see the settler who has taken over the Al-Gawi home. The big one. He's wielding an M16 fully automatic assault rifle. This M16 was issued to him by the Israeli government. As the first Prime Minister of Israel, Ben-Gurion, tells us, there are no civilians in Israel. There are only soldiers who are on leave for 11 months of the year. And while this man's waiting for his month of duty in the reserves, the M16 stays with him. Now, both these men, the settler who's occupying Nasser Al-Gawi's home, the other man here, were told to stay away from Sheikh Jarrah for 15 days. However, if the tables were turned and Nasser Al-Gawi had the automatic rifle, you could imagine what would happen. He would never see the light of day again. And this was a lot of what ISM does in Sheikh Jarrah. We're there to document. We're there to bear witness. And sometimes I felt like we were being affected there. There were times when I would awake to screaming and I'd find a settler threatening one of the residents, either the Al-Kurds or the Al-Gawis, with death. I would put up my camera and they would stop. However, because of the geopolitical dynamics that go into what Israel is doing to occupation, the Palestinians, international accompaniment isn't as effective as it is in South America, say Colombia. And the international activists also felt the violence from the settlers. There'd be times when the internationals and the Israeli activists who were standing in solidarity with the residents of Sheikh Jarrah would be sleeping in the tents, the protest tents. The young settlers would come through, throw bags of urine or bags of vomit on them. The female activists were sexually harassed numerous times. And you always had to be careful with your boots and your blankets and any other possessions that you might have, because the settlers were very keen to steal whatever they could. And how could this occur? How could people living in subsidized homes given to them by the United Nations, because they're refugees, be threatened to become refugees again? Well, in the case of the Al-Gawis, the settlers who annexed their home, cited illegal or allegedly forged Ottoman-era land claims. These land claims said that people of Jewish heritage had owned, rented, or maybe just worked the land in the late 1800s. And therefore, under the right of return, people of Jewish heritage should be living there today. But this right of return is only one way. The hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who are refugees in other countries surrounding Palestine have no hope of getting back. Some of them still have the land claims, the deeds to their homes. Some of them still have the keys. However, hope is very minimal. But this isn't the only way that they're ethnically cleansing East Jerusalem. They designated most of Sheikh Jarrah a green zone. A green zone is supposed to be slated for a park or a recreation area. And because just behind the Al-Kurd home is a supposedly Jewish prophet named Shimon al-Sadiq, they'd like to turn most of the Sheikh Jarrah and the homes and the 28 families who are living there into a parking lot. So, in 2000, because the Al-Kurd's family was expanding, they needed to add an addition onto their home. They applied for permits numerous times. Each time they were denied. They said, this is a green zone, you can't build. But they built anyway. And the Jerusalem municipality and the Israeli government let them build the whole house. And just when they were finishing, just when they were putting the bars on the windows, the Jerusalem municipality came and took the keys from them and declared the building illegal. However, 9 years later, after much litigation, these keys were handed over to an Israeli settler organization. And now settlers occupy the supposedly illegal home. Now, in Sheikh Jarrah, this isn't the only place that green zones are cited to ethnically cleanse the neighborhoods. In Silwan, just south of the old city, 1,500 Palestinians are threatened to be turned into refugees because 220 homes have demolition orders. And why? Well, supposedly, the city of David, the fabled city of David, is buried underneath Silwan. So, archaeological excavations began in the 1970s. In the beginning, they were scientific and done with care and the consent of the community. However, now, all scientific aspects of this archaeological excavation are lost. They're turning this into a tourist attraction, some Judaized Disneyland, where they bring tourists in and they bring them underground and they show them what may or may not be evidence of Jewish heritage here in the city. Now, what are the Palestinians going through? Well, these excavations are now very, very sloppy. This causes road collapses, as you can see here on the far left, and if you can see above this door, this is a home, and the foundation is cracked because what's underneath is becoming very, very weak. Also, there have been stories of children going to kindergarten who have to jump over large holes in the streets just to get to their kindergarten, and sometimes schools even partially collapse. But this isn't all. They're turning Silwan into a militarized zone, supposedly for the protection of the tourists. So soldiers and police with fully automatic weapons are always a common sight here. Despite this repression, there is resistance. They've erected, the Popular Committee of Silwan has erected a protest tent, which has been up for, I believe, 16 months now, if not longer. Also, there's the Wadi Hilwa Information Center, where children can go and they can take theater classes, English lessons, have access to computers, and other resources. And there are also spontaneous demonstrations that occur. Despite the vehement violence that's visited upon those of Silwan, they still make some sort of resistance, some sort of demonstrations. Now, Israel is struggling to find out how to deal with and how to squash this nonviolent resistance that's spreading over the West Bank. So this leads to retribution and repression. And sometimes it leads to repression of activists who are standing in solidarity with Palestinians. I spent about my first 3 weeks in Palestine, primarily in Sheikh Jarrah. I was there for about 16 to 18 hours a day, doing whatever I could, whatever was needed from the community. However, in these 3.5 weeks, I was arrested 3 times. The first time merely for filming the eviction of the Al-Kurds from their home. The second time was when I attended a demonstration that was organized by Israeli activists of the organization Just Jerusalem. On Shabbat, Fridays, they would march from West Jerusalem to Sheikh Jarrah. They would partially start in West Jerusalem because they wanted to raise awareness in the Israeli public who had no clue, even though it was maybe 2 miles from where they were standing, of what was happening in Sheikh Jarrah and in East Jerusalem. They were met with insults and slurs, from their own, the people who lived in their same society. They would come to Shekhtra on Fridays because the settlers who had annexed the homes of the Palestinians in Shekhtra